Hello, in this video I want to dive into a very controversial topic, and that is the Chinese conquest of Tibet, and answer the question, is it justified, or was it ultimately justified? And on this picture you can clearly see that Tibet was a part of the great Qin Empire. And after the fall of the Qin dynasty in 1911, Tibet proclaims independence, and here you can see a Tibetan flag, and they are essentially a theocratic feudal system under the Dalai Lama. And the Chinese Communist Party emphasizes this part in order to justify their conquest that happens in 1951. But what needs to be said is, yeah, here you can see the autonomous region of Tibet as it looks like today, with a very limited autonomy. But here is how China looked after the revolution of, I'm talking about the fall of the Qin dynasty, and before Mao Zedong ultimately unified it, before the start of the Japanese conquest. China is just a collection of warlord states, and Chiang Kai-shek at this point is too weak in order to conquer Tibet, and Mao Zedong is just trying to survive the nationalist campaigns of annihilation against him. We are talking about a situation where communists are outnumbered 60 to 1. And the history of Tibet and China, even before the communists conquered it, is a history of conflict. The Tibet tries to conquer the land from the Chinese warlords in the early 1930s, and they ultimately lose, and their conquest of Qinghai region is unsuccessful. The warlords take it back, the land that Tibet conquers. And even Chiang Kai-shek spoke about conquering Tibet. In his vision of unified China, there is also Tibet. So it isn't an issue between communists and nationalists. They both agree that Tibet is a part of China, and even Stalin famously said, well, there should be no question about whether or not Tibet is China. For centuries it was Chinese, and therefore it is China. And that is also partially how Mao Zedong rationalized and justified his conquest of Tibet. But the communists also emphasized the fact that it was a very rigid and brutal caste system. And here you can see the three lowest castes that existed in Tibetan society before the caste system was abolished by the communists. So here you can see the untouchables. We are talking about butchers, executioners, corpse disposers, prostitutes, and they are seen as filthy and as polluted by the rest of society, and for them there is no escape. Once they are born into their caste, they simply have to remain in that caste. Then there is the Tibetan equivalent of serfs, and even slaves exist. We are talking about tribes that lived between Tibet and Assam, and their children were often captured and turned into slaves. Even Western historians admit it. And here you can see the art that portrays the suffering of Tibetan serfs under this brutal religious theocracy that existed under the Dalai Lama. But and yeah, there is even a Chinese propaganda movie about, the movie came out in 2005, about a serf that lives under this oppressive religious theocracy, and he's tortured by his evil feudal lord. And then one day the PLA enters Tibet, and he and his female friend try to escape and join the PLA, and his friend escapes, and he is caught by the evil feudal lords, and he vows not to speak until he becomes a free man. And spoiler alert, in the end he is liberated by the Chinese communists, and like in a religious scripture almost, he gains the ability to speak. at the same time. Of course, uh, he still doesn't have a freedom of speech, but he gains the ability to speak. And well, I simply do have to admit that yeah, serfdom is bad and feudalism is bad, and the act of abolishing the caste system is an example of Chinese communists doing something good. And even President Xi, the president of China today, commemorates the abolishment of slavery and feudal system in Tibet. And he even famously said in one of his speeches that it was a peaceful process, the process of abolishing feudalism in Tibet. But that really just goes against common sense. I mean, one could say that it was a justified process, but to say that it was peaceful, that simply isn't true. And here's my take on the situation. If it wasn't for all the other horrible aspects of Maoism, like the Great Leap Forward and uh, all the other crazy and tyrannical aspects of Maoism, I would probably even agree with the mainstream view in China that Tibet should be Chinese, simply because it was for hundreds of years, and it was a very rigid and tyrannical feudal system that was ultimately abolished by the communists. But unfortunately for the Tibetan people, uh, yes, they they no longer lived under feudalism, but they were forced to experience a new, far more bizarre type of serfdom and slavery, and that was the Great Leap Forward. And here are some of my favorite Great Leap Forward posters. And Great Leap Forward is truly one of the most bizarre things that happened in history. 38 million people die in this crazy process of taxing the highest possible amount of food out of peasants and then selling that food and investing it into building a huge military. But ultimately, the process failed, not only because 38 million people died, but it didn't even produce a functioning military in the end. And this poster truly speaks for itself. I mean, just look at it. A guy is reading Mao Zedong's Red Book while flying on a rocket. And I guess this poster is supposed to illustrate this crazy vision of progress that Mao had in his mind, but it also illustrates how crazy and detached from reality the entire process of the Great Leap Forward was. And the Great Leap Forward is a process that's also combined with Mao's anti-religious campaign. And what is interesting about it is that Mao still uses Taoist symbolism. Here you can see the 8 immortals of Taoism crossing the sea, and in the same way Mao envisioned his nation crossing the sea as a metaphor of going through hardship. And here you can see the surrounding areas around Tibet, where the Tibetan revolt started as soon as the Great Leap Forward started, because what the Great Leap Forward meant for an average person was a tyrannical rate of taxation that left barely enough food for people to survive. And it was also accompanied with the confiscation of weapons. And what makes the situation harder in this instance for for the Chinese communists is the fact that Tibetans also lived in the surrounding areas. So there are also rebellions in Sichuan, Yan'an, Qinghai, and the Tibetans are a proud horse riding nation. So the fact that they had horses also make them harder to beat than, for example, people in other areas of China that were also rebellious. They were very skilled in riding horses, and one of their deities was even a horse-like avatar of Vishnu that is in Buddhism symbolized by this god that kind of became a symbol of anger in Buddhism. but yeah, and the fact that we are talking about a mountainous region also makes also made the conquest of Tibet harder, but ultimately the communists won, and they suppressed the rebellion, and they start to close the Buddhist temples, and Mao is determined to wipe out religion from the face of China, and especially Tibetan Buddhism, because he sees religion as a source of feudalism and as a source of oppression. And Dalai Lama is even allowed to escape to India because Mao Zedong is afraid that if he kills Dalai Lama, that then India will attack him. But the other Buddhists of Tibet are not so lucky. They are often killed, and they are prohibited from doing their secret rituals that ensure that the souls of their loved ones can live purgatory. So many of them are killed, and then what's even worse for their families, they're not even allowed to do their holy rituals that enable the souls of their fallen warriors to go out of the purgatory. And yeah, Mao Zedong is ultimately the Tibetan people suffer the same fate that the rest of China had to suffer, which is why even today there are many in Tibet that want freedom and independence. And I would argue that once the level of oppression becomes high enough, that then nations have a right for freedom, have a right to proclaim independence. And in the case of Maoism and the Great Leap Forward, I would support the Tibetan struggle for independence. But if a more normal regime conquered them, I think that I would ultimately support the territorial integrity of China. But in this case, Mao simply managed to be crazy enough for me to support Tibet for other reasons. But yeah, this issue still remains a controversial topic in China, but also in the rest of the world as well.